Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak on behalf of the Greens in this place on the Bail and Crimes Amendment Bill 2024. And Mr Speaker, having listened to quite a lot of the contributions today, I would like to say, first of all, we oppose the bill. But we oppose it for a couple of reasons, which I'll go into. But I think it's important to note that over and over we hear that the biggest change for a young person's life comes because of one person, usually. One person in their life that takes enormous interest in their life and gives them unconditional support. And what I've heard today is a lot of members, if not all members, recognising that actual rehabilitation, actual change for these children and young people who, let's be clear, are acting in ways that are appalling, that is a whole of government across every area that needs to be done and looked at. So, Mr Speaker, we oppose it because it seems incredibly poor law, and we oppose it because it actually is not going to achieve what it intends to do. And, you know, if you don't believe me, there are much more learned lawyers in this place, but there are certainly very learned lawyers in the Law Society of New South Wales, in the Aboriginal Legal Service, and countless other legal minds in the state who have said that they have grave concerns about this law. And Mr Speaker, it would have been a really good opportunity to have an inquiry. I know that our spokesperson for the Attorney General in the other place, Sue Higginson, and I know the member for Balmain and the member for Newtown and I and our entire party room were pushing for that inquiry. I believe that the opposition were pushing for that inquiry. I've raised these matters of this particular law myself with the Premier, and I believe that there's a desire to fix something, but a refusal to do the work that is required to genuinely disrupt what we're seeing. And Mr Speaker, it's certainly in my community, I want to say to my own community, I'm not condoning acts of violence, I'm not condoning the break and enter, we're not condoning stealing of cars, and we're not condoning crime at all. But what we see is that this tightening of the bail laws, what we've seen in other jurisdictions and what we know to be true is that it just doesn't work, and locking children up as a goal is absolutely appalling, and we know that this will significantly increase the number of children and young people in remand locked up. So, and I don't think that can be disputed. Mr Speaker, I'm not going to go into the law. I believe that the Attorney General, that this particular law and where it sits, the Attorney General and also the Shadow Attorney General, I think that did that pretty well in terms of going through the schedule. Mr Speaker, we will be moving an amendment in this place. Our amendment supports the consideration of the impacts, the judicial officers to look at the consideration of the impacts of this law on the well-being of the young person, and also available custodial and non-custodial options. And the second part of our amendment will be to review Section 22C, which is the temporary limitation on bail for certain young persons in relation to certain offences, certain serious offences. We want to see that review done within 6 months. This is a temporary law, and there were members in Labor who made that very clear. This is temporary. So we're saying, let's review this in 6 months. We're opposing it. We don't like it. We think it's draconian and it goes against the rights of children and young people. But it must be reviewed in 6 months, and a report on the outcome of that review tabled in this House within six months. So we will be moving that. Mr Speaker, as I say, the Aboriginal Legal Service, Amnesty International, Save the Children, Human Rights Watch, my own Dean of Law at Southern Cross University, former Magistrate David Halpern, and others have condemned these reforms as counterproductive. I also note the 600 legal experts that sent an open letter to the Premier this week expressing their alarm at these reactionary reforms. We know that this was a very disturbing stories in the community. I know on the weekend in Alstonville there was a community safety meeting, and what worries me about the sorts of conservative views that were expressed by a couple of people there is that they think that this is actually going to stop the crime, and there is absolutely no evidence that it will stop the crime. We think this is a reactionary appeal to the extreme right, and it is misleading. It's misleading to our people. It's misleading to our communities. And I know that there are many in government who are extremely conflicted about these reforms, and I've listened carefully to what they have said today. I also think the Premier is genuinely conflicted on this. The bottom line is that we need a whole of government and huge circuit breaker in terms of investment. Now, we welcome investment in diversionary programs in Moree. I know that at one stage was a union organiser based out there. I've seen firsthand in my time as a teacher in Broken Hill and in my time in criminal law in the Northern Territory and other places, I've seen that what the level of commitment that is required from government in terms of funding of those truly diversionary programs is enormous, and it seems that it's not about throwing money, it's about looking for those programs that actually work and holding them to account. And Mr. Speaker, on the back, it would be remiss in not saying to every Aboriginal person in this state, and especially in my own community, that it is pretty cruel that after a failed referendum, because of a post-truth absolute horror show in terms of that the sky was going to fall by changing the referendum to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country, a very colonial backlash and a failed referendum, that we are not putting Aboriginal people at the centre of this debate and at the centre of policy and decision making in New South Wales. Closing the gap, what a joke. One of the most significant things we can do is make a difference in a child's life, because the gap starts, and I've seen it, the gap is in years 1 to 2. That gap, when that happens, it is almost never closed. And Mr. Speaker, this spike in regional crime, as I know my colleagues will also talk about, is a symptom. It is not the cause. It is a symptom. Economic factors are the number one thing I believe, and we believe, that are inciting criminal behaviour. It comes as no surprise that we have been in a cost of living crisis for the last 2 years, and that's when these crime rates are up. If the government was serious about preventing youth crime, they would be addressing health, education and housing, and tackling the underlying causes of crime. This is not a quick fix. And I'm sorry, the Coalition is certainly not getting off scot-free, because they have been at the helm for the last 12 years and they have not invested in our regional communities. They have not invested in regional communities in terms of those fundamental supports. And I'll give you some examples, Mr. Speaker. I note that the satellite office for the Aboriginal Legal Service in Byron Bay was recently forced to close due to a lack of funding from the federal government. The Aboriginal Legal Service do incredible work, and that was outrageous. Mr. Speaker, we have seen massive cuts to mental health supports. Last year, we know that the federal Labor recently cut the number of subsidised mental health visits from 20 to 10. I note the work of the Chair of Portfolio Committee 2 in the other place, Dr Amanda Cohn, her recent inquiry to Lismore, and what she saw, which was the stripping of services, and that came out from all the participants. And these services told the inquiry that they need recurrent funding to support their programs. So what we saw was a privatisation of these services under the Coalition, and lo and behold, there's no recurrent funding. They're doing the heavy lifting, they're doing the work, the frontline work, and where do we find ourselves? We find ourselves in a very pointy situation as a society. It costs over $700,000 to lock up just one child for 1 year in detention. $700,000. Can you imagine? So I noticed that a speaker for the Nationals talked about a child that had been bailed 70 times. I can't even go there. But honestly, if there is a judicial officer, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker,
The member seeks an extension of time. Is the extension granted? Yes. Extension's granted.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, my sincere apologies, I didn't look that we had a Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, imagine what $700,000, just $700,000, could do for organisations in the electorates that are represented here, the 93 electorates, certainly in my own electorate. Just one example, Fletcher Street Cottage, which, despite what was said today, Byron Shire has the highest rate of rough sleepers in the state. That would fund a whole year of their service to homeless people who are experiencing homelessness. So can you imagine for each child? Now, Madam Speaker, I do believe that I genuinely believe that every single member here would like to see this situation change. They want the crimes to stop, I get that. But this is not, if this was quick, it will not be quick, and what we will see is more and more children in lockup, and that is not the solution. So unfortunately, and also I believe that it is a absolute breach of the rights of children and young people. Madam Speaker, also note the work from the ABC released this week that tracked the over-policing of First Nations communities by police. It found that Indigenous people in Ballina Shire are almost 10 times more likely to be searched by police than non-Indigenous people, with 80% of searchers finding nothing. It is very clear to me that we have a long way to go. And Madam Speaker, it was interesting for me to talk to some of my own police officers and people in this place who live out west, people that I regard their views highly, and talking about the sorts of programs that actually work. And Madam Speaker, there's a program in the member for Lismore's electorate called Balunda, which is a diversionary program for Bundjalung men. Obviously, there's a threshold in terms of the crimes, but it is a jail. It's a jail, if you like. It's a diversionary system without walls. And I was part of setting up education in that many years ago. Education support, and honestly, so local community elders, a raft of support services are all on hand, and it is genuinely making a difference in terms of recidivism and also the sort of life chances that one gets. And Madam Speaker, I did hear from one of my police recently, he was talking about visiting a young person in Akmina in Grafton and talking about asking that young person, what is your greatest fear once you come out? And this young person said their greatest fear was that they were going home they were not going to be able to get their medication. They had severe mental health issues, and that their home was not appropriate for them. And we know that a lot of young people, a deterrent of going to jail is not a deterrent. That is a terrible, terrible indictment on our society. We all have a responsibility to these children, because guess what? Once they enter prison, they don't ever really get free of it. I'm not just making that up. All of the evidence tells us that. And so what we're doing is we're just ramping that up. And Madam Speaker, it's incredibly upsetting. And I do note in Armidale, I just want to shout out a program that was mentioned to me called Backtrack. Let's find these things that are working. Let's not throw money at things that aren't working, and let's invest and support things that we know do work, and there are countless examples. And Madam Speaker, in terms of the amendments that the amendments we're moving today require judges to consider the wellbeing of a young person if bail is refused, require consideration of the availability of beds in detention facilities, and consideration of alternative pathways to justice. Our judicial officers already look at the full picture. They do, and if there is a judicial officer or a magistrate who keeps granting bail, you have to ask yourself why that is happening. That is because of a reluctance to lock children up in jail. Thank you.